This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast, in-depth conversations with experts from the worlds of arts, sciences and Mātauranga Māori. Brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences. Kia ora, I'm Dr Barb, and Trudy is away on a well-deserved vacation this week. So we are going to make the most of it and go full on into our local elections warm-up mini-series. So this is the 2025 local elections warm up. So it's not really about the elections, it's just issues that we think form kind of a background context to the local elections. And I am lucky enough today to have in the studio with me not one but two experts in this area. So I have Simon Cox from GNS, the Geological and Nuclear Sciences, here along to talk to us about all the risk assessment and physical things and a whole lot more. Thank you very much for coming along, Simon. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you for having me.
And along with Simon, we've got Jonathan Rowe from the DCC here to talk to us all about the, the adaptations phase of it and all the people-based stuff. Is that right, Jonathan?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Barbara.
It's fantastic. So I'm just going to go through the background so everybody knows what esteemed company I am in here. So Simon Cox is a principal scientist at GNS Science in Dunedin, a BSc Honours and Masters and a PhD all through Otago University in the Geology Department. Career of wide-reaching, including research that has played a transformative role in advancing geological knowledge of the South Island, the Southern Alps and Antarctica. So sticking close to home, but really wide-ranging. Work on Pounamu and Aotea. Aotea, can you just say quickly what that is?
So Aotea is a beautiful blue stone that you get in one or two places on the west coast. And it's related to the Alpine Fault, and Māori think of it as a cousin to Pounamu. It's a very special treasure. Very
special and very beautiful as well. So mineral treasures are directly supported by iwi Māori. You have directly supported iwi Māori as a part of the broader package of pure and applied work characterising landscape evolution and hazards from groundwater, earthquakes, landslides and erosion. So a bit of treasures and a bit of hazards as well.
A treasure hunter, Simon.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to...
enjoyable part of it. You're not Dr. Doom for once.
No.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's always that balance in geology, isn't there? That whole kind of backwards and forwards. I just want to give a little bit of a shout out here for the impact of Dr. Cox's work and outreach, which has been recognised through multiple national prizes and a Lifetime Achievement Award. He's worked on South Dunedin since 2016 and continues to help communities develop resilience to effects of natural hazards, climate change throughout New Zealand. What was the Lifetime Achievement Award?
A few years back, just during COVID, I think it was, but GNS sort of nominated me for in Science New Zealand Awards and gave me a Lifetime Achievement Award, even though I haven't kind of finished my career. So I thought I could go on holiday after that, but unfortunately that wasn't quite allowed. It was a huge honour and a nice recognition of all the work they've put in over the years.
And it's well deserved as well, because not just a pure research scientist, but also very committed to outreach and engagement with community in lots of different parts of New Zealand as well.
Yeah, I've done quite a bit of work in other areas, but generally South Island focused. Yeah. I've been involved with immediate response to the earthquakes, landslides and when large bits of mountains fall down. But the most enjoyable part of any work has been working with iwi Māori and with the communities. And I guess I'm deeply committed to working in South Dunedin. I'm Dunedin born and bred. I was educated here, and I feel a certain responsibility to give back to the city that educated me and gave me the lifestyle that I have. South Dunedin has always been, ever since they had the first trouble, there's always been an interest. So I'm deeply committed at a personal level as well as a professional level.
And I think that shows in the thoroughness of this work that's come out here as well, which we will obviously go through in some detail. So also, Jonathan Rowe, Am I saying that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. A BA degree in geography from Otago, but also a BA in international studies from Manhattan College, New York, and then a master's in international relations from Victoria here in New Zealand.
How did I end up here?
Yeah, how did you end up here? What even is international studies?
Basically, international politics, trade, and the like.
It's
development.
politics.
Yes, you could say that. So yeah, just Dunedin boy, went to Otago, was fortunate enough to get a soccer scholarship to New York.
Oh, right. So you were in Otago first, and
Yes.
then you got a soccer scholarship to New York.
Yes, got a soccer scholarship. So played football for Dunedin Technical out in South Dunedin. Got a scholarship to New York. Arrived there 10 days before 9/11.
Oh.
So Dunedin boy, straight into the cauldron of New York.
Me.
Yep, I had 3 fabulous years in New York at college there. Came back, ended up in central government in Wellington and did a master's degree, and then had sort of 15 years in the diplomatic service for
Right.
Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, mostly in the Pacific doing development work, so infrastructure, health, education projects, disaster response, climate change and the like. And
Right.
then
And some of that climate change disaster response must be quite similar to South Dunedin as well in the Pacific Islands there. It's all about groundwater and
oh, absolutely.
flooding and
lots
pluvial
and very much the kind of jack of all trades. So I'm in this role at the moment with the councils where I am not an expert in anything, but I've got to manage a whole series of different issues and topics.
because of course you're the program manager for the South Dunedin Future
Yeah.
program at the DCC. So that is, have you got quite a team under you there?
Yes and no. So we have a small team. We've got a team of 3, so me and 2 others
Yeah.
within the council. But then the team's kind of like an onion. If you think about different layers out, we've then, one of the layers out is a whole bunch of colleagues internally across DCC and ORC, whether that's doing
Right.
natural hazards or 3 waters or roading or parks or planning. So these people help us. We also have a consultant team that do a bunch of work for us as well. So depending on which layer of the onion you're talking about,
Right,
it's either a very
yeah.
small team or a very large team.
Because of course you've got people like Simon that are feeding into that
Absolutely.
report in quite
Simon's
a big
a
way.
layer. He's his own layer.
He's a layer all onto his own.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to run through. I just thought I'd just say right at the start. The reason that we're doing this now is because you have got you're asking for feedback as part of it. So you've got this sort of 5-phase system. What is happening, and what matters most, which are the 2 phases that you've sort of gone through already since 2023. And you're on to the what can we do, and then the make it happen, and then how's it working phases are in the future,
Yep.
if I'm understanding that right. So part of this is this sort of constant feedback loop, because you have to have community buy-in for this sort of massive undertaking that you've got here, and you have to make sure that what you're doing is actually what the community wants done, and that the community knows what's happening and that something is happening.
Totally. And so a quick South Dunedin Future 101, kind of what is this thing? Basically, we'll talk about the science, I'm sure. Basically, South Dunedin has some issues with water, whether that's groundwater coming from below, sea level rise coming from the side, and sort of more severe and extreme rainfall events, so water coming from the sky. There's already an issue now. The place is flooded a bunch of times. There's quite a big history of flooding. It's flat. It's the bottom of a catchment. It's a former coastal wetland, right? Yeah. And because of various things around climate change, it's going to get worse. We're going to get more water. So my job's basically running a program, figuring out what do we do about that. There's a big piece there around understanding what's happening. So this is how is the environment changing, and this speaks to all the science that the Regional Council and NIWA and GNS and Simon and others have dug into over the last decade or so. There's a bit of a so what, how are those changes to the environment going to impact on the things that matter to us, so kind of people, places, assets, our homes, our communities. And then the next bit is, what can we do about that? And there's lots of things that we can do, and they kind of sit broadly on a spectrum of fight and flight. You can build pumps, pipes, seawalls. Down one end, we could do nature-based solutions, parks, wetlands, streams, or we can just move people out of harm's way. And my job as the program manager is basically facilitating a discussion between the kind of technical work, the community, the stakeholders that are affected, and the decision makers, the politicians, around kind of what are the trade-offs involved in all of that, and what's the kind of best way forward. And that's what we're doing over 5 years. So we're about 3 years through.
And I imagine it's not one or the other. It's not cut and dry. There's different things might be appropriate in different parts of South Dunedin, and it might be a mixture of different solutions, or it might just be tidal flight.
Well, that's the problem, right? Unfortunately, it's not one simple.
If it was simple, we wouldn't
solution.
still be talking about it, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. So we're here because it is complex, because there are decisions to be made, there are trade-offs. Yeah. It's going to probably involve doing lots of little things over a long period of time rather than one big bang. And people have different views on this stuff, right? Yeah. So a lot of this is about unpicking what people want, what's important. If we live in a world where, we can't have everything, we can't afford everything.
Yeah, because different things have different costs as well. So there's financial and
different benefits,
and different benefits. So there's financial benefits,
yep.
and
they don't fall evenly. And so it's all kind of who are the winners and who are the losers.
Yeah, and how do you compensate those things out? I guess as well.
There's short term, long term. So it's a little illustration of all of the things that we're trying to kind of step through. And basically, my job's not to recommend a particular approach. My job is to facilitate that discussion, kind of get a really good read on what are the scientists saying from that kind of cold hard science perspective, what do the engineers say, what do the planners say, what's the kind of sentiment in the community.
Yeah, so it's getting all of that information that's really hard, solid, maybe not that you know the actual answer, but that you've got a good idea of the probabilities of the risks. Even that is, getting a step forward, that this area is more likely to flood, this area is more likely to flood more in the future or less in the future. Yep. It's unlikely that there's going to be much less in the future in many places, but,
No, but also that, if we do need to change, there's enormous opportunity in change.
Yeah.
So, while I don't want to underplay the challenges in front of us or kind of how scary and impactful change could be for many, many people, there's a chance through change to create not just a safer South Dunedin, but a better one as well. So this is where you start getting into this urban regeneration discussion, better housing, better infrastructure, more green space, more economic activity. What does that look like? Yeah. And that's a really exciting upside to this whole discussion that we're trying to kind of weave in and figure out what does that look like, because that can completely change the whole discussion.
Yeah, and I guess a change that is anticipated and managed and that you're prepared for is always much easier on everyone emotionally as well as financially than a change that's imposed by a massive event that's beyond your...
Oh, totally. And, we have a few kind of sayings in the small team that we have. One of them's, we need to change, or the water will change it for us. So we want to have some control, some ownership, be quite active rather than sit back and wait for this to happen. And there's also that bit around, generally, if you do something slow and gradual and in a planned way, it's, it has less impact for, it's less cost than if you just wait for some big event and we have a disaster response and a recovery that's super expensive, very traumatic for lots of people, and can have lasting impacts. Yeah,
and I guess also that for me, knowing more about something and the process and what's happening and why it's happening and why it needs to happen, all those things, that makes it less traumatic on me. And I think the more informed people are, the easier it is to sort of figure out what they feel about something as well. And maybe some people's previous ideas about how they thought what needed to be done might change as they gather more knowledge to themselves. So I guess that's where you come in, Simon. Just before we start down that road, though, I did want to just mention the drop-in sessions, because you have got quite a few drop-in sessions here. Forbury Park, 146 Victoria Road. You've got Thursday, the 1st of May, from 1 till 5 p.m, which is a long session. The 2nd of May, 10 till 2 p.m, and Saturday the 3rd of May, 10 till 2 p.m, all at Forbury Park. And then you've got the St Kilda Bowling Club, 33 Royal Crescent, Thursday the 8th of May from 2 till 8, which is a nice evening one for people who can't make it during the day, and Friday the 9th of May from 10 till 2. And then you've got some public workshops here. So you've got Forbury Park, Saturday the 3rd of May from 10 till 12. You've got a public workshop, and the St Kilda Bowling Club, Thursday the 8th of May from 6 till 8 p.m. What's the difference between a public workshop and a drop-in session?
It's one of them you need to do a bit more homework for.
Okay, which one?
The workshop. No, basically, the drop-ins, as the name suggests, you can drop in and out anytime.
Right.
Kind of have a look around, ask some questions and go. The workshop, we kind of sit people down and talk them through, like this conversation.
Right.
You know, what's the history of this? What are the key factors? What do the reports say? And kind of try and extract lots of information out of them so we get a really good sense of the community's view. But
Right.
all of that work, all of those public engagements are designed to get a really good read on what the community thinks. There's also an online survey that people can fill out on the website.
And we'll put the link to that in this episode description there. It's just on the DCC website. If you just type in DCC South Dunedin Futures, it'll pop
just
up and
Google
it's
that
just
and
there. And you can also, actually I should say, on that same page, you can download the PDFs for the risk assessment and all the proposed futures options. And I'm imagining that they're available in the city library and any of the Dunedin city libraries. There'll be paper copies of them if anyone wants a paper copy, or just pop into the DCC.
If you're old school and like paper.
There are a lot of us left that are still old school and like paper. Just when you're reading a big document, it's nice to be able to flick the pages and see all the diagrams at once.
Totally, they are big documents as well, and if your computer's like mine, they sometimes crash it.
Yes. Anyone who was listening this morning on my Facebook Live would have seen I was struggling with my computer. Anyway, that's a totally different...
Happens to us all.
Happens to us all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flick to Simon now and just say, why South Dunedin? What is the issue? Just go right back to basics. Why is South Dunedin an issue? And what did South Dunedin look like before there were people there? Before there were Europeans there, I should say.
Well, even before we go to South Dunedin, I think let's think about New Zealand.
Okay.
In a wider way. This is this funny little island that's just sticking up out of this massive ocean. And it's only an island because of the collision of the two plates. The Australian plate and the Pacific plate are crashing together, and that lifts the land up out of the water, essentially.
Right.
It thickens up the crust enough to actually make some land.
Right.
And creates the islands. And under the North Island, we melt one of the plates and create the volcanoes. But down here in the south, we've got the Alpine Fault and the Southern Alps, and it's incredibly dynamic. It's one of the fastest moving kind of plate boundaries and the most deforming pieces of land around the world. It's not like a continent of Australia or America.
It is a new continent, though, isn't it? So
it is. It's part of Zealandia. So there's this submerged continent which got thinned as we pulled away from Antarctica.
Right.
But it's now being pushed together enough to thicken it up, and it's floating on the mantle essentially.
Right.
And that is enough. It's floating enough to give us a wee bit of landmass.
Right.
But it sticks up into the roaring 40s, and as a result, we get this orographic mountain-based weather system with rain on the west coast and dry on the east coast.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just remind me what orographic is.
Yeah, mountain-related. Yeah.
So the weather, the winds come through those 40s, and the 40s. Wind hits the
a wall of the mountains, and it rains on the west coast, and occasionally it sneaks around the other direction and
we get
comes
Southland
in.
wet.
And we get Southland wet, and then now and again we get these tropical cyclones that come down and rain very hard, and that pattern is subtly changing and eroding the land and changing it. And of course we have earthquakes and volcanoes and landslides, and more we're going to have droughts and wildfire and all these things. So anywhere that you choose in this piece of land is going to have
hazards and risks.
Some sort of hazards and some sort of risk. And there's a spot down here in the south which is a really nice piece of land with gorgeous landscape around it that has now formed, Dunedin's been built upon. And we're sitting in what was an old volcano.
Yeah.
That has pretty much, that was 13 million years old, 13 through to about 10 million years old.
So it's not likely to...
So it's been and gone and done its thing, but it's the old remnants of that volcano that have been eroded out and left the peninsula and the hills. And then linking between the peninsula and the hills is this much younger connection of soft sediment. So as we had glacial cycles, the sea level goes down when there's ice on Antarctica and on the continents, and then it comes back up. So sea level 20,000 years ago was way off the coast, right out at the edge of it, and very, very different. So we would have had land.
And that's because that water was all locked up in the ice caps.
In the ice caps. And now since in the last 6,000 years or so, it's come back in and it's flooded the old river valley that was the harbour, and it's come in and basically just constricted from both directions, the harbour and from the sea, this really narrow piece of flat land, which was originally it would have been sort of braided rivers and maybe something like the Tiree Plain.
Right, and then the peninsula would just have been an outcrop sort of
just
between
hills.
parts of the river.
Yeah, and then it's sort of been drowned, and so we've had an estuary on top of it.
Right.
So we've got this sort of very muddy, dirty, clayey sediment.
And that would have been also Logan Park and there as well,
yeah,
right?
well, Logan Park was originally, it was still water, so it was underwater for quite a long time.
Yeah.
But South Dunedin would have been a very boggy land as that sea came back up. And the dunes have formed. And they sort of protect us from the ocean. They've just come from sand being blown along the coast and forming the dunes.
And am I right in thinking that every sort of 500 or 600 years pre-European, the peninsula was an island and it sort of blew out the sand there?
Every now and again the sea comes through the dunes. I think it did in 1923 or so, but since it's been sort of formed into John Wilson Drive and things, it's
so that's that infrastructure sort of holds it up.
Yeah.
And of course the dunes have changed complete shape since they've got all of that Ammophila, aside from all of the man-made built infrastructure. They've got different plants on them, and that Ammophila builds high dunes, whereas I imagine if they had the native pingao there, they would have been sort of long, flat dunes.
Yeah. I guess the key thing is that they're not active dunes anymore. They're not behaving as a dune system.
Right.
They've been modified by having playing fields and everything on it, and the city built beside them.
Right.
And so you're not getting the wind blowing it up and depositing the sand and so forth.
Yeah.
But you've got this very low-lying piece of land which is essentially marking the height of an old estuary.
Right.
And then they started draining it and building on it and things. And then they decided to reclaim some land along the harbour to stop the high harbour levels coming in and to create some more space. And that got built up to about 1.5, 2 metres.
Sort of along Portsmouth Drive.
Yeah. And the problem with that was it stopped the natural drainage outlets for the streams that came across South Dunedin and would have normally flown into the harbour.
Right.
And because the natural drainage is stopped, it then relies on the stormwater system to be pumped and bring that water out.
Right.
So while it helped to stop the harbour kind of coming in and eroding things and causing a problem,
it's made another problem. So we have to be careful with whatever we do, that whatever we do, we don't make something else worse.
Yeah.
There's a lesson in that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that the natural drainage is gone, and so now we're relying on the stormwater system to do all the work for us. Another thing that a lot of people don't realise is that quite a lot of that land sits at about 0.5 to 1 metre above sea level.
Right.
That's the median sea level. But the high tide and the storm surge levels in the sea during a big southerly swell is about another metre higher.
Right.
So we're already below high tide level.
Yes, so that means that
every day during those big storms, or certainly during the king tides and things. But we're protected because of the dunes.
Right. But of course those dunes are made of sand, right?
They're made of sand, yep.
So I imagine that the water goes through the sand quite easily.
So yes, it does. So now that's where it starts to get interesting from the point of view of thinking about it doesn't go through enough and quickly enough to make it wet every day.
Right, with the tide, because of course the tide comes up and then it goes back out again.
It goes up and it goes
So I do know
goes
some
back.
stuff about how the world works.
Yeah. But when you look in some of the boreholes,
Right.
they do have quite a strong tidal signal in the groundwater.
Right.
So there's a borehole in Kennedy Street which has a 30 centimetre tide. So it cycles every day,
Up and down 30 centimetres.
30 centimetres.
Wow.
And
that's, how far is that from the actual coast?
I think it's about 400 or 500 metres.
Right. But that water is essentially, the water in the sea is pushing all that groundwater up.
Yeah, so
like 400 metres inland at Kennedy Street, it's
but
pushing
it's
it
not
up.
flowing all the way in. It's kind of like it's turning on the pressure at the sea. It's like having the water in a hose.
Yeah, it's pushing it from
pushing the pressure.
that bit pushes the next molecule of water all the way along, and then eventually it goes up at the other end.
Yeah,
basically. Yeah,
and so
you're not going to get fresh seawater and salmon coming out that end.
No, but it is brackish.
It is brackish,
and it has a wee bit of it has a salinity to it that you can measure if you measure the amount of electricity or the conductivity of that water, the electricity that can go through it. You can tell that there it's about 20-25% seawater.
Right.
And in all the boreholes we can look and see what.
And have you got boreholes all over South Dunedin?
Yeah. So Kennedy Street was an early borehole that was put in 2010 by the Otago Regional Council. And they had 3 boreholes at that time at Tonga Park and Bathgate Park.
I must be old because that just sounds like just yesterday.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound very early at all.
Well,
it said 1910.
That was the time that really got people worried because they saw that the water in the borehole was going up and down a lot at that one site.
Right.
And there was this realisation that, okay, it only goes up and down each tide, maybe 30 centimetres, but if the tide stayed high, then you might flow some water through,
right,
and that ground would stay high all the time. So the idea is that with sea level rise, it would make the groundwater rise as well.
Yeah, and of course it's so flat out there that a little bit of rise goes a long way horizontally.
Exactly. So the concerns came from that. And even when you go down to Tonga Park and Bathgate Park, you can see the tide.
Bathgate Park, that's the one with the big dinosaur, is it?
No, Bathgate Park is the one down beside the old Donaghy's building at Hillside Road.
Oh, yeah, with the big ropes.
Yeah, where there used to be. And so down there there's a tide, it's 1 millimetre.
Oh, right.
And in Tonga Park, it's about 1.5 centimetres.
Right. So that's quite a lot less than 30 centimetres, but it still is getting all the... Like, it signifies that that's all still joined up, right? It's still... The water, the tide is actually still having effect and far back.
It takes about 6 hours for the tide to get across the city. So high tide in the sea is low tide in the groundwater at
how strange is that?
Park. It's kind of cool. It takes a while for that wave to move across underneath. So that was the kind of situation back in 2010 that got everybody worried and started to cause an issue. There was a report in 2016 done by the Otago Regional Council where they did some modelling on that. A chap called Jens Recker, a very clever groundwater modeller, kind of raised the issue really. And the idea was that if all of South Dunedin was like that, then we've got a major problem. And that happened, of course, about the same time as the 2015 floods.
Right.
So it was like kind of a double whammy of things. So it's like, what the heck's going on? And that's where the concerns really started to go for what are we going to do with South Dunedin?
Yeah, because of course it's if you've got that groundwater kind of sea level rise there, the groundwater's coming up as well, and then you get a sudden rain event on top of that. You've got water coming from the ground up and water coming down the hill and nowhere for it to go. It's all going into and I guess that's just can you build a stormwater system that's big enough to cope with that?
I guess in an ideal kind of a setting where there wasn't stormwater system and there weren't a city built on top and the rain could percolate into the ground, what normally happens is it rains and a proportion of the rain goes into the streams and a proportion goes into the ground as groundwater. And if you've got space in between the grains, you can store quite a lot of water in the ground until it gets down to the water table where the groundwater, where it's saturated all the time. All the pores are saturated.
Yeah.
So as that rises and gets less and less, the amount that the ground can store decreases to the point where if groundwater comes to the surface, no water can go into the ground.
So it all becomes surface flooding.
It must come off or go in streams or all be taken away by the stormwater system.
Yeah.
So as it shallows,
what streams are still left over South Dunedin? Are there any?
There's not really. It's all engineered with the
even the existing streams
system, and the groundwater the rain doesn't necessarily all get in either because it's falling onto roofs, falling onto concrete and things.
Yeah. And that's when we go back to the population side of things, because Dunedin, am I right, and it's still the most densely populated part of New Zealand?
Was at one point.
Oh, it's not anymore.
No longer. No. So if you imagine,
is it Queenstown now?
I imagine parts of Queenstown would be
probably triple bunking.
You think about Auckland, the residential tower buildings that they've got there. So
so they've built up.
Yeah. But I think at one point it absolutely was. But it's quite a common understanding or misunderstanding now, I think, that it is the highest density in New Zealand.
Yeah. I'm sure I've said it multiple times.
But it was highlighted. It was highlighted that there are a large number of houses within a metre of sea level, and so Dunedin has the most number of houses at that zone of potential trouble compared with other centres.
And we don't have a lot of multiple story high-rise buildings or apartment buildings or that. We do have a lot of single story dwellings, particularly in South Dunedin, and they're really close in South Dunedin, like closer than residential houses. Like when I lived out in South Dunedin, it's like the whole backyard was concreted and the house was like, you could just tell if there was an architect, they thought concrete and they thought square and they just went with it, and that was their kind of...
Yep.
And I
there's some lovely areas as well. That are
there are.
There are lots of gardens as well, and it's surprising when you do
go
take an aerial photograph and process it and work out how much green space there is. It's high. There's still quite a lot of green space, and there's still quite a lot of water goes into the ground, and so it is quite important.
But can about between 60 and 65% of the land area is impermeable now.
So that's like concrete or asphalt or
roof and buildings.
Or roofs and buildings, And I guess that means that the remaining 35% is trying to
take 100%
absorb
of the water.
all of that extra water.
Along with the stormwater system.
Along with the stormwater system,
But then just to add to that, in some ways the good part of the story is that we're having been worried about this tidal bore and they're going up and down a lot. And after the floods, we really needed to know more about what was going on in the subsurface. So we installed boreholes everywhere. So we had 35 boreholes that we've measured, and a whole lot of them are running at 15-minute intervals, giving us a reading all the time.
That sounds fantastic.
We have to go and collect the data and download it. They're not all telemetered. Some of them are telemetered, but mostly we go and download, and you go out with a laptop and get the data and things. But what we discovered is that one borehole at Kennedy Street is really odd. It's sitting probably in an old channel with sand in it. But most of South Dunedin is really clayey mud.
Right.
And you can't get the tide into it.
Right.
So although it's 30 centimetres at Kennedy Street, most areas actually still only have a 1.5 centimetre tide.
That's interesting, isn't it? That's a very good lesson for monitoring and replication
on multiple data points.
Multiple data points, because so, you really, like, if you just want to extrapolate to the whole of South Dunedin from one point that was almost certainly not put there randomly, but just kind of...
Yeah, in 2019 we installed a network of boreholes. It wasn't expensive, but it took quite a lot to convince people to do it. We were begging and borrowing money from all over the place in order to drill these shallow holes.
Yeah.
And then installing the wee loggers that we have, they're about $300-400 each. They're actually really cheap.
Yeah.
So the whole network actually was a really cheap piece of investment. And from that, we got a whole lot of information.
And you're still getting data from it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that means that if sea level is changing gradually, or as it's changing gradually, you will be able to record that change.
Well, we may be able to see it, but one of the things about groundwater is that it actually goes up and down so much. I want you to think of it like a living, breathing beast that's under the ground, that's just breathing in and out every time it rains. Maybe one lung's working on one side, it's going up and down, and it fluctuates so much. It can fluctuate about a metre and a half each year.
That's a lot, isn't it?
But the sea level rise is only going to be maybe a metre or 10 centimetres or...
obviously it depends what timescale you're thinking of.
The natural variability of how much it moves because it's getting rain into it and things is far greater than the
sea level rise.
Yeah, but it'll just lift that base level. It's still going to be doing that breathing. And
it's just going to lift it up an extra... like if you put 20 centimetres on something, that's... Because, of course, when it's down low... You don't really mind.
It's not a problem.
It's
not
fine.
A problem. It's down
All
below
it's
the ground.
doing is it's lifting the highs even higher.
No one knows it's there. We don't even think about it.
Yeah.
But it's when it starts to come out as a spring. So it's moving up and down. And if you wanted to know the best way to calculate the groundwater level without having a measurer would be to know what was the rainfall for the last 30 days. What's the average rainfall? And... If you take that average rainfall, it would actually measure the groundwater level pretty well.
Oh, right.
So it accumulates.
Anyone can measure their own rainfall.
And they can measure their own groundwater too if they want to drill it. Well, and in fact, some places you can just dig a hole. Some places it's 50 centimetres below ground and you've got groundwater.
Yeah.
So it's moving all the time. But the question then is, if sea level rises, how much will it lift that and how much is it going to change it? And so the first thing you've got to worry about if the groundwater comes up is that the rain may not be absorbed by the land.
Right.
So you're relying more on the stormwater network.
Right.
So then you've got to say, well, do we need to engineer more pipes and have bigger pumps and things like that.
All those things.
And the natural answer to that would be yes, no question about it.
Yeah.
But the tricky thing is, and the really hard part about it is, you might start doing that, but then the groundwater might start emerging out of the ground somewhere else.
Right.
And then you get a flooding from below problem, not a flooding from above problem. And that flooding from below happens at a different rate. It causes different types of damage, and it will be delayed some amount depending on the rate of sea level rise. So it makes it really difficult to make some decision about that infrastructure investment because you don't quite know. If I put a pipe in here and it's going to cost $1 million, am I going to get 10 years functionality out of it, 20 years functionality, or 50 years?
Right.
If it's 50 years, that's fine. If it's 20, it's questionable. And so the whole system then you've got to look at where's it going to be affected and by the changing events. And of course, we talked about the rain not absorbed into the land, and then eventually the groundwater's coming out, and so it'll start to come out at high tide.
Right.
And you'd get some high tide flooding and you get some soft areas that might damage the roads or the pipes, the the groundwater will leak into the
Or
sewerage
the piles
system.
of people's houses or the...
Yeah, it might get to there, but it'd probably be leaking into the sewers first and might fill those up so you can't flush the toilet.
Then you get that wastewater sewage problem as well, where you've got
so it may be that even before your house gets
mixed in.
wet, if you've got old pipes, they could be leaky, then they could fill up. So, so there's a question of, well, should we, as the groundwater comes up, should we replace that piece of infrastructure? But then, not that much later, sea level is actually at the point where it can start to come in over Portsmouth Drive.
I was going to say as well that climate change is not just going to have sea level rise, because you're going to get, if you put more energy into any system, you're going to get bigger events. So you are going to get bigger rainfall events as well, and more frequent rainfall events.
Yeah.
And storm surges. So that's going to, if they coincide with those high tides and a bit of sea level, then you're getting multiple things coming on top of each other. If you've got
warmer air, you can hold more moisture, you can hold more water in that packet of warm air, and so when you dump it out,
when you hit a mountain,
or the atmospheric rivers, is that the term that's used?
Yeah, that's a different kind of thing, but that's it. It's an atmospheric river is when you've got
kind of from the tropics,
that land carrying that warm air all the way down across usually a nor'wester or something like that, and coming in and hitting that barrier on the west coast, for example, hitting the mountains and dumping out that heavy rain. And of course, it's carrying warm air is carrying more water, which means your intensity of your rainfalls are different.
Yeah, and I find that's an easy way to think of climate change, because climate change is all about us putting more energy, more carbon dioxide and stuff in the air, and then any system that's got more energy in it, and I know it's a bit of an analogy here, but if you've got that warm air there, then you're going to have more intense cyclones, more intense effects of everything.
Essentially, the air's trying to dissipate the energy of the sun. It's trying to get out of the way and get rid of that energy, and it's going to be carrying the moisture with it. But if it's a bit warmer, it's carrying more moisture, and so those systems of trying to get out of the way of the sun's radiation mean it gets carried around. It gets carried around differently, and ultimately, the climate change is transferred by water.
Right.
And so, whether it's in the atmosphere or whether it's from flooding or whether it's from sea level rise and having changes in ice masses, it's all related to water.
Yeah. Crazy water.
Crazy stuff.
Can't live without it.
But then eventually, in South, we go from a kind of a rain-related problem to adding in the groundwater coming out of the ground, and then we have a kind of a potential inundation over Portsmouth Drive, or if the dunes don't maintain them, if we don't maintain that protective barrier from the dunes, it could be through the dunes. And I guess to me, as a geoscientist, I try and think of all the hazards, and I think, well, what if we had a tsunami first and it erodes the dunes, and then we have high sea level and storm surge? Because it's always the double whammies.
It's those double whammies, and it's the things that, you've got things that are kind of a risk, but they're quite a high risk of them happening, but a low impact if they do happen. And then you've got things like a tsunami that it's less likely to happen, although over the long time everything's likely to happen. But then if it does happen, or when it does happen, it's a massive impact. And so you've sort of got to think of all of that. When you're thinking about long-term solutions, you've got to think about those smaller, more frequent events, more likely events, but also those long-term events that are going to happen.
Absolutely.
But just we've got no idea when.
Yeah. And if there's one thing that I've really learned with working with people in South Dunedin and from other events, it's actually the frequency of events and the returning of episodic events that are really important for driving people's and the community's well-being and the response of business and insurance and things like that. When we first started working, and this is sort of 10 years ago in this space, we were looking at what might it look like on an average year,
Right. Because people talk about 10-year floods and 5-year floods or 100-year floods.
Yeah.
I always think that's all a bit daft.
Well,
I don't quite.
it isn't. It's just a probability.
It's a probability,
number.
and somehow they've turned.
It's an inverse, so it's the one over that. So it's a 0.1. A 10-year flood's a 0.1% in any one.
In any
0.1
year.
chance in any 1 year of it coming of that size. And a 0.01 would be the 100-year flood coming of a certain size. So to us, it's useful.
If we've got an increasing, like if we've got climate change on top of that, and the probabilities are increasing, then that 1 in 100 year. I mean, people say,
eventually becomes 1 in 50, and
1 in 50 years or 1 in 10 years and stuff. And then people go, I don't understand this. People have always said it was a one. How can we possibly have 3 1 in 100 year floods? And that's when I think it sort of loses.
You're better to talk in probabilities, but people don't like talking in probabilities either. But
do you know what fixes that?
No.
More gambling in the population.
Yeah, maybe.
Not that I'm advocating for gambling, but that is what fixes. If you do
into some of our options.
Yeah, so if you do like international studies and you look at how like general populace looks about probabilities and how well they understand them, and then you look at the prevalence of gambling in the population, because it's all about odds ratios and stuff. So yeah. Probabilities.
Well, I quite often, say try and look at our natural hazard probabilities and risk in terms of looking at it compared with lotto and what your chances are of winning lotto versus what you're spending on your insurance and that sort of thing, and there's different ways of looking at it. But we could still have quite a good little earthquake here, and of course all of these other things can happen.
I am going
to
tap on wood now. I've been telling everyone not to tap the table, but really,
So 1974 earthquake did quite a lot of damage, but it wasn't very big.
That was well before my time.
No, well, I remember it, but
before me.
Yeah. So I mean, that was a local earthquake that knocked down a lot of chimneys locally, and we've got some pretty bad designs in some of our buildings around Dunedin. And people don't really understand risk all that well. But people need to kind of think about levels of the difference between the hazard probability and risk. Okay,
right.
So it's the difference between here's a good way of looking at it is, say there's a shark in the water, that's the hazard. Right. There's no risk until somebody gets into the water.
Right. So in South Dunedin, the hazard is the flooding, but there would be no risk if there were no people living there.
That's correct.
Right.
But then there's a different risk profile for a surfer who's out there for 4 hours a day versus somebody who has a quick 5-minute swim.
Right.
Right? So it's what gets in the way and how long they're exposed to that hazard.
Right.
And in the case of earthquakes, for example, we often think of the risk to our house or the risk of a big shake. But actually what we need to be thinking about is our risk profile. Like, where do we spend most of our time?
It's at work. Most people, a lot of people. Like my husband's in his office all the time, and that building there's got a really high earthquake risk rating.
He possibly sleeps in his bed for 8 hours a day.
Well,
maybe.
Yeah, that's true. And there's probably
and there's a lot of people that sleep in their bed immediately underneath a big 1-ton brick chimney that could fall through their roof and land on them. So they actually spend a third of their life underneath a 1-ton thing that could kill them.
Right.
And then you've got to go, well, okay, you can insure against the price of the chimney, but you can't insure your kids' lives. And the worst thing that you could possibly have is your child being killed by something that in a way you're responsible for that level of risk. And you can mitigate that risk by putting a sheet of or 2 sheets of really good plywood in the attic.
Oh, really?
Those bricks would fall in that holds the bricks. Or you could take down your chimney if you're not worried about the aesthetics of that, because half the people have got heat pumps and they don't even use the chimneys anymore.
Right.
And yet that, for Dunedin, that risk is a real thing.
Oh, that's actually a really easy, quite cheap way of dissipating the risk
Yeah.
Or a large proportion
or
of the risk.
Tie down your hot water cylinder so that it won't break and leak water all through your house while you're away for the weekend after that earthquake. That's why you tie them down.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. But do you know that you're supposed to attach wardrobes and things to the walls?
Yeah, well, yes, they won't fall on you then.
Yeah.
But you've got to think through what your risk is. And so for somebody in South Dunedin, people often ask me, would you buy in South Dunedin? And so the first thing you can talk about the hazards, natural hazards.
Yeah.
And there's all these things that can happen, and they'll all happen a certain probability, and they'll all come back at different times. But then you've got to say, well, what's your risk profile? Like, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen to you? On one hand, you might actually have a really nice place to live. You might really enjoy the community. You've got flat land and things like that. And in a 10-year period, there's probably not necessarily a problem for you. But you may find that the house price goes down a bit, or it goes up a bit, or, all sorts of things that can happen.
Right.
You've got to say, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? And it might be that your house gets flooded so often that it gets to the point where
it's uninsurable.
And so then you've got to say, well, is that a problem for you? Can you self-insure?
Right.
Or do you rely on the insurance? So individuals, there's so many different types of things that individuals have to think through.
And of course there's more options for richer people, right?
There are more options, and that's one of the things that the whole South Dunedin Future program has to be cognizant of, and in fact all of our nation has to be cognizant of, is that inequity does not become part of policy, or policies that come in do not generate inequity, and that you don't advantage, well, you could advantage some if you really want to, but
I imagine that's
from
quite
where
hard.
most New Zealanders would sit, they wouldn't see that as acceptable.
Yeah, because we're built on the whole fair go and everyone have a fair go type aesthetic. That's how
so
we still, despite some of the more recent politics, that is still how we like to.
We don't want to see any policies associated with natural hazards and natural things that are going on that will advantage some and
people
disadvantage
rather than others. Yeah.
But
so
but
what
we
do
should
you
have
say? Would you buy in
place.
South Dunedin?
Well, it would depend on whether what my circumstances are at the moment. So, for example, do I think that house is good good for a while? And I would probably say, maybe it might be a great place to be
and of
for
course
10 years.
It doesn't help people who are already living in South Dunedin. Yeah. Because, if that's where you're living and that's where your community is and that's where your house is, then that is where your house is.
So the area I come from with is I have to do what is happening. I assess the hazards, and then from there I stop.
You stop,
and it's only a personal thing from there.
Right.
And
I guess that's where you largely take over,
Jonathan starts to take over in terms of the
crystal ball gazing on how people think and what they want.
Well, it's not so, because you're also doing that outreach and that communication.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think we've got a couple of minutes left, but this is going to be part one of a 2-part series. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say we're at the risk assessment here. So we've really talked about the flooding and the groundwater and what those hazards are and what the risks might be, and touched on a few of the possible things that can be adaptations to it. Unless you've got any last, like a 60-second sum up there.
Well, I suppose that Dunedin is a place where there's definitely issues, but there's issues all over the world. And although it's been raised as a place of being a problem, there's going to be problems all over the world. And I think people need to have confidence that we're really starting to understand Dunedin very well. And it's tricky getting those solutions, but I would like to think people have confidence that the science is there now where it wasn't 10 years ago, and that we can tell people exactly what's going on and what they should be expecting.
And what the probabilities are.
And that's where science has really contributed, I think, to Dunedin.
Yeah.
And where it's still, we're ahead of a lot of places, and that's what the insurance companies want to know, so that they are also informed.
Because insurance companies are really good at probabilities and data.
Indeed.
Thank you very much. Hey, you've been listening to the OI podcast with Dr Barb. This episode is part of our Local Election 2025 warm-up series, where we focus on getting the background, context and information about important local issues out to the voting public. If you've enjoyed this episode with Simon Cox and Jonathan Rowe, we think you'll enjoy the Local Water Done Well with David Ward, Public Toilets with Alison Breeze, and the repay of Chewing Gum and Walking Housing with Aaron Hawkins. You can support the production of the OI podcast by becoming a member for the www.otago-institute.org. Thank you. You've been listening to the OI podcast, the shout out for the arts, sciences and Mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI podcast on ORFM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by ORFM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.